Again, this is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com, and welcome to another webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Cloud Passage. Today's webinar is on testing infrastructure as code with security, 5 practical tips. And infrastructure as code, by the way, has become one of the most important or one of the most talked about aspects in DevOps, and we're very lucky to be joined by today's presenter, and it's Ms. Jamisha Fisher, Systems Administrator for DevOps at Cloud Passage, sponsor of today's webinar. And Jamisha, calling her Systems Administrator or sysadmin is a mouthful in this case because Jamisha has a history of working at companies like Google and GoGrid and Norvax, and she is a hands-on technical person who's here to talk to you about real-life experiences and, with a little technical dirt under her fingernails to prove it. So with that being said, Jamisha, welcome to DevOps.com webinars.
Thank you so much, Alan. Pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to be talking with you all. So, Alan, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was going to say, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you. So again, guys, welcome to my talk. Before we dive right into kind of the nitty-gritty, though, I want to ask you a question. Why security? Why am I talking to you about security and how it's important to testing? Like, what is the purpose of talking about it? The reason why I like talking about security and talking about security and infrastructure as code specifically with it is a whole lot of people have misconceptions when it comes to security, that security is thought of as this really nice, shiny black box that's tightly wound in red tape. And you can't get anything done because this black box has to stay pretty much pristine as it can be, and the only people who can touch it have the proper permissions to do so, and a lot of the times you can't get past the black box, or you can't get stuff done without having this black box around. And the people who take care of the black box, they can sometimes be very, very frightening. Sometimes you can just hear no, and they can be difficult to work with. So I really want to remove this perception. And the reason why I want to remove this perception is because I believe security is not that way. And I believe it because, I'm one of the people, who cares about security. So I just want to again reintroduce myself. My name's Jamisha Fisher. I do work in Ops at Cloud Passage. I'm both passionate about both security and systems as well as infrastructure as code. And I'm here to discuss with you security and why it's important in testing, as well as some tips to keep in mind when you're setting out to test your infrastructure as a code, or testing the infrastructure resulting from the infrastructure as a code. So one of the reasons we should keep in mind to keep in mind that also that that we should be testing for security, and why it's essential to the bottom line when we're rolling out infrastructure, when we're rolling out things to deployment to make a product or software or things to serve to the people, is that security is in the public eye more than ever. You now have vulnerabilities that used to be obscured by names or CVEs or titles, now getting branded, now having brand names, now having sites. For instance, Heartbleed. Heartbleed was a SSL vulnerability that came out recently, that basically the vulnerability made the SSL technology itself really, really vulnerable, to the point where people not only had to patch, but they had to renew every cert that they had. This also resulted in and a whole lot of sites asking for you to reset your password. Many of the major sites did this. And the reason, and the main component behind it is because it was the first publicly branded vulnerability. It had a site, it had a logo, it was shared across social media. Everybody knew about this, even people not in tech or familiar with the vulnerability. The people behind the Heartbleed site even said, I think that the fact that it had a name, had a catchy logo that people remember, really helped fuel the speed with which people became aware of it. And people did become aware of it, though, it was still lagging after 2 months, because though it was patched by the majority, 3,000 servers still were unpatched after 2 months. So this led to a trend that started to happen, that with major vulnerabilities, they started to get names. And that made vulnerability awareness more prevalent. However, at the same time, while it made it more prevalent for the good guys, it also made it more prevalent for the bad guys. And that resulted, this resulted in much more. At the same time, while you're seeing vulnerabilities, you're also seeing a whole lot more breaches of various industries. I mean, you've seen it in retail when we're talking about Target or Target. In retail, you're seeing it in Sony, where there was the Sony hack and Hollywood got affected, and suddenly, people were asking actors, how do you feel about this? You're also seeing it in the usual sectors that have pretty lockdown security, like healthcare, with Anthem and Blue Cross. And these resulted in digital fraud and crime just affecting everyday people. Like with the Sony hack, even I remember reading an article with Angelina Jolie, and they were like, so what do you think about this private conversation getting disclosed, and how do you feel about this being public knowledge, and what that person said? And she's like, I haven't really read the article, but I am worried about that person because she's a real person and she has kids. Or in the case of the Anthem hack, it happened in early 2015, and it resulted in the compromise of a database containing 80 million records. Around that same time, TurboTax shut down its state tax filings in about 19 states, citing fraudulent submissions. Now, I'm not going to say it's a coincidence. Well, I'm not going to say that it's a coincidence or that any of those might be connected, but still, how that could be affected in cause and effect is something to think about. And then you kind of have real life things such as, more recently, the Ashley Madison hack. Now, everybody may have their opinions on whether it was good or not to reveal that data, but it did have a real impact. A man from Saudi Arabia ended up searching for refugee Iceland because he had to use the site because he was a closet gay man, and where he was in Saudi Arabia it's illegal, so he could lose his life for it. So there was real impact there, and it got noticed. Like, one of my friends, because of that incident happening, she's the owner of a site, a very widely used site, and she was like, okay, I don't want to see my customers' data when I'm adminning stuff. I don't want to view that data. It's sensitive, and I want to secure it. I want to make sure that it's there. And for me, that was an important concern that, as owners, as people who build infrastructure should have. And not many of them do, surprisingly, because some people, abuse that confidentiality. I'm not going to say who, but it happens. So it's important, to keep in mind that security is in the public eye more than ever. So even more than ever, we need to keep in mind security. So in addition to that, oh boy, oops, getting ahead. Okay. Trying to go back. There we go.
You
Sorry,
got it?
folks. Technical difficulties. Yeah.
You all set? Were you trying to go backwards or forward?
Yep. Nope. We got it.
All right.
Sorry, folks. Also, testing use in QA aligns with some of the security principles we have. So when talking about roles in security, we can see how each of the principles in security kind of line up with what we want to do in testing and making it sure why it's important. So, for instance, so what I have here is kind of the security triad. If you guys are unfamiliar with it, it's like the three basic tenets that security people go over. It's what I learned in school. My educational background is in information assurance and security engineering, so I got this beat into my brain. So starting from the top, confidentiality is a requirement that private or confidential information not be disclosed to unauthorized individuals. So the end-all be-all goal for testing, or what we should be assuring for, is to assure that, that ultimately, customer data is secure, and that's what the results of our testing should be. And we can also test the security of our systems, especially in infrastructure as a code, without necessarily knowing production data necessarily. So that's one thing to keep in mind when dealing with confidentiality, because that's like the biggest thing when it comes to, again, going back to that black box that people worry about. It's like the black box is protecting that data, that valuableness. So, but there are ways that we can test without necessarily, knowing necessarily what specifically that data is or having exact access to it. The next thing is, when we talk about integrity, the definition in the security world is that a system and its data are not manipulated for unauthorized functionality or alteration. And so when we think about that in the testing sense, we're trying to, when we're usually doing testing, especially as infrastructure as a code, we're trying to make sure that our code is working in the way that we want, that it's predictable. But at the same time, we're trying to make sure that we're able to audit it for when it's not, or testing for failure, which I'm going to go into later. One second, got to catch my breath a little bit. And so the last thing to talk about is testing for availability, which, especially in my company's case, it's really important. And the definition in security there is for any information to service purpose, the information must be available when needed. So the biggest thing about testing is to test to make sure, hey, the site's up and that it's functional and that the people can use it. And so we're testing for reliability. But we're also, more so on the infrastructure end and on the back end, testing for performance out of the resources that we have. And that's very important to keep in mind as well. So now that I've filled your head with why security is important to testing, let's go into the 5 practical tips that I have that you should keep in mind. Well, the first one is test often and continuously. And I know what you're thinking with this. It's like, Jamisha, we already do this. We already have testing set up. We already have Jenkins. We already have continuous integration. Why are you telling me this again? What is the point of you telling me to test often and continuously? I want you to ask yourselves, do you test for security? Do you have it in your tests? Or do you have it in your organization that security is made a priority while you're testing as well, with your application or your infrastructure as a code? Are you testing for the security of your servers after they get spun up? Are you verifying that, they can't get have a remote exploit, logged on them? Most companies, especially startups, don't, or if they do, it's a one-time thing. They only do it when the audit rolls around. They only do it, when it's absolutely necessary, and, after that they're like, well, I don't have to do it again. Like, there's no point. They only do it to check a box. And that shouldn't be the case because technology changes fast, and also auditing is starting to keep up. And you can get dinged for not testing regularly. Also, when they come to audit you, they're like, hey, are you doing this regularly? So it's important to test often and continuously, but especially with security. And along with that, so another thing that I see companies not doing is not testing the integrity of the whole stack. So I know what you're thinking. It's like, but we're only talking about infrastructure as a code. Like, why do we have to, test stuff with the application code too? It's like, because it's important that you test both, because if one gets popped, the whole thing gets popped. The whole thing's vulnerable. So you want to not only test your infrastructure as a code, but everything that connects with it, and that includes application code. But the question is, how do you do that? And most of that is within the workflow. So, for example, many companies, they'll roll security testing into the development process, whether it's through various tools, testing code, or testing through deployment, or testing through integration, or even in the deployment process, where near the end of it, especially for nonprofit environments, they'll do a security check just to make sure things are okay, just to make sure things are okay. Tongue twister there, which brings me to the next point, is that you shouldn't just rely on one tool. There are now, one thing I'm seeing in DevOps, which I'm really, really happy to see. Really happy to see. I'm starting to see many of the configuration management companies start to come up with security tools as an add-on to what they have. Chef's doing a really good job at this. They recently came out with something, and they have they're recently pushing something called Chef Compliance, and that is amazing. And I won't knock anybody for using that tool, but you just shouldn't use the single tool. You just shouldn't use the one tool and be like, oh, we already have it in Chef, so that means we're secure, right? No. Because the one question that people don't think about is, okay, what if the Chef service goes down? What happens then? Or what if that only tool that you have to use for security goes down? You all of a sudden have a single point of failure in your security, and that's not good. So instead, security has this thing called defense in depth. So it means having multiple layers of security in place to ensure the security of the system. And again, this can kind of be all over the development process. So you have localized stuff to which you can create security policies for in RSpec or Chef spec. You also have things that, again, test infrastructure and servers while it's coming up. Again, bringing up Chef Compliance. There's also third-party tools that you can use to check servers. For me, personally, at our company, one of the tools we use is to, eat our own dog food. We use Halo. But we also, have external tools too. some external tools that are used locally that you can use to scan different networks. Tenable's Nessus scanner that's been out for a while, but to use that to, scan server vulnerabilities. And this is before and after deployment. Or if you're testing some code and you want to make sure that it is secure and that you're keeping something in mind. There's also things to test application code and to integrate it really well. Like one of the things that a friend recently enlightened me to, which is really cool, is there's an organization that does security, that does web application testing and is focused on it. They're called OWASP, and they have what you would call Z-Attack proxy, which is used for application testing. And the cool thing is that they do have documentation on how you can add it to continuous integration. So if you wanted to add it to your continuous integration workflow, you can do that, which I found really cool. So there's a whole lot of tools that you can kind of use, but bare minimum, you should at least have 2, and you should at least have 1 that's external to your environment. It's not used by anything. Just so you can have something on the outside looking in, and you can, have redundant checks to verify whether, the stuff that you're getting from your internal tools are not a false positive, because false positives do happen. And you want to make sure that you're on the right path. So now that we have the tools in place and we're talking about, having security and testing the full stack and having the tools to do it, let's talk about experiencing failure. Now, one of the first things I learned about in testing infrastructure as a code, especially in test-driven development itself, is the first thing you do when you're writing a test is write a test that fails. So it's just as important in security to test whether our code allows us to work through failure reliably. And I mean more than just through, a security incident like a vulnerability. I mean, what is the case that happens when, again, because we're talking about availability here, of what happens, when a service goes down, or, something catastrophic happens, like all of a sudden services need to be rebooted in the cloud, and, you all of a sudden need to set up an infrastructure so you don't go down. This is something to keep in mind, and it's actually in a whole lot of compliance rules. It's like, okay, how quickly can you recover from, if a service fails or if a server goes down? How quickly can you come back up? And that's something important, to test and make sure that it works. And this is something you necessarily can't do with a suite. Sometimes you have to have an environment to just, roll out on and test and be like, okay, let's test the failover and make sure that it works. But it's just important to do that. It's just important to know, hey, whether my backup is working, whether you can rebuild from scratch, or whether you can fail over from a replicated server. You have to know and experience failure to know that you can be confident in the systems that you have, and that's important. I mean, again, like for instance, the story that we had for one of our compliances is that we for compliance, we test. We test, and you should test at least once a year for this, whether you can recover from a backup, like a complete environment, and that's important. And you've probably already been through failure as well, even if you haven't tested for it. Again, like I know, though they say the cloud is faultless, they do have reboots too because they need to patch as well. So it's important to kind of be ready for that firefight and know that your code can reliably get through those. The last thing I want to reiterate, and I know this kind of goes along with my first point, but I wanted to kind of point it out by itself, is that you should review and improve testing processes regularly. Because as technology changes, and as your company changes, attacks and vulnerabilities change too. So while you're testing regularly, you also need to know that what you're testing for is on point and, you know, is aligned with the latest attacks out there, that you're still secure. And give me 1 second. And that you're able to, especially security, keep up to date with the trends and what's going on. So it's always good to review and improve testing process regularly, quarterly if you can. And so in conclusion, security is important to, security is important to have in testing. You should test often and continuously with security, because that's important to have in mind. You should test the integrity of the whole stack, because if you don't have integrity in one place, you lose integrity everywhere. You shouldn't rely on one tool. You should at least have one that's external. You should experience failure. You should know how that's like, so you know that your infrastructure as code is reliable, and you should review and improve testing processes regularly. Because if you have all those, then you're pretty much golden.
Excellent.
Are there any questions?
Jamisha, we have a few questions. Yes, it's Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So first of all, we do our own little chaos monkey here at DevOps.com, and you know, we make the presenter handle your own slides, and I apologize if we were going back and forth there. But hey, that's chaos, right? It's all the DevOps way. So you got through it, and congratulations. I thought it was an excellent presentation. There were a lot, you know, those tips for people to take to heart.
Yeah.
We're going to open this up to questions right now. And we have a few from the audience that let's get right to. The first one says, please describe infrastructure and code as code. And what is it exactly?
Infrastructure as code.
Yeah, and what security aspects of it should one test? So let's break it in two. Let's start with, because I get this question, Jamisha, from people as well. What do you mean by infrastructure as code? Right? Are we, you know, beyond servers running virtually, right? So you're not going to have servers as hardware. They're in software. What else do we mean by infrastructure as code? So
when I mean infrastructure as code, I mean infrastructure designed through code. So when we think about creating software, we think about it as, you know, or creating software as we code it, and then we push it out to the world, and it becomes software that's usable and usable by users to click on stuff, to buy things. So in that same vein, infrastructure as code is exactly that, infrastructure created through code. So we use things like Chef and Chef recipes to create code, or we use Puppet, configuration modules to make configurations, or we use Ansible to spin up things initially and get them running to install Puppet or Chef or whatever configuration we have. So it's basically using code or coding languages to create infrastructure. The thing to, that one is actually a really interesting question. To test for security is interesting because it depends on what you have to check for and what standards. And a whole lot of people don't know about that. So they usually have to go off of guidelines that they find, or usually CIS or other standards. But when testing for it, you can do it in a whole lot of ways. There's a whole lot of ways to shave a yak. That's all the answer that I have for it. There's plenty of ways to go about it. I mean, you can use audit mode for, like, if you're going the chef route, you can use audit mode to create policies to know what to check for. Us personally here, what we use to check to make sure everything in line, again, it's twofold. One of the things is that we have a cookbook that, you know, checks and makes sure that everything is in compliance, and then on the outside we have like its backup check through Halo to verify that what we have in place and the code that we have put in place is verified. So it's, again, it's a twofold thing, again, talking about using more than one tool, so that we use Chef to kind of verify that the configuration that we have is set up through the recipe, and that the configuration that we have in place is secure. And then we use an outside tool to verify it in addition to Chef. Does that make sense?
Yep, very good. Our next question is, I am in startup mode. On your experience, what could you recommend for small and medium-sized companies with smaller staff and wider responsibilities? Some advices are hardly applicable for smaller companies. Yeah, I've lived that life. Jamisha, why don't you take a shot at it?
Like, what are you recommending for smaller companies as far as security, or as far as building infrastructure?
So I think it's really sort of, and I'm sorry if we can go back to the question, Jules, I think we wiped it out, but from what I read of it, Jamisha, you know, and this is a common thing I see at startups, is we don't necessarily have the security resources, either as standalone security or even within our ops team, to do some of these you know, types of stuff that you're talking about, and some of, you know, what you will, is best practices. And so, you know, and too often, right, we wind up compromising best practices for the sake of speed and getting it done, of pressure to get stuff out the door. And, you know, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Jamisha, but in my, you know, 15 to 18 years of experience in security with both big companies and smaller companies, that's the truth. That's what happens, right? There's a balancing act, and it's really, security comes down to managing risk. So if we can do everything you possibly can, you do it, but we can't. We can't. Yep, it's a you almost on a case-by-case basis got to figure out what's best for your unique situation.
And pretty much I agree with that. It's like, it's a case-by-case basis on what you have to do with your situation. But if you can think about it, take it in small baby steps. I mean, you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to security, but the DevOps way is, you know, kind of doing things incrementally. So if you can add it even in just a small way, then that'll help farther down the line.
Yep, fair enough. All right, here's our next question. Is it possible to set up security tests as part of infrastructure modifications when following infrastructure as code way of doing work?
Can you set up security? Yes.
Set up security tests, yeah.
Set up security tests, or Yeah, you can. We actually have that partially set up here whenever we submit code. We actually have some hooks um, in a tool we use called Santoku. And the way that we do that is anytime we submit code or anytime we upload code, it basically goes through and automatically runs, linting tests and RSpec tests and tests like that, and it'll show us the results on the screen, as well as spits out stuff to Slack.
Yep.
So yes, there is a way to do that. But again, it depends on what your needs are and the resources that you have.
Okay, next question. And I would just, before we jump to the next question, Jamisha, I will tell you that a big part of what we talk a lot about in DevOps and security is exactly that, automated security testing, even before the code is deployed, right? Let's start testing code in development and all the way through so that by the time we push the button to deploy, we have a high degree of confidence that that code has been tested and passed before we're sending it out there, right?
Exactly right. And that's the thing, especially on infrastructure code testing, why you need to have it, because you don't want to push code out and then all of a sudden, it breaks things.
Got it.
So.
Okay, next question. How is security, in a little English, how is security involved in testing? The best practice is to keep the security a different process. What is the QA role in infrastructure and code and security? So Jamisha, I've done a lot in this area and spoken to a lot of people, but if you want to answer first, I'll let you go, and then I'm going to add in if you don't mind.
Repeat the question, because that was really loaded.
Yeah, I think
that was a loaded question.
I'm trying to make sensible English. I apologize. So I think it means how is security involved in testing?
How is security involved in testing?
Right. Is the best and I think when he says testing, he's referring to QA. Or she is, I don't know if it's a he or she, but.
Okay, so how is security involved in testing?
In other words, do we keep it as a different process than traditional QA?
No, I don't think so. I think, and this is one thing I'm starting to see, and I'm glad to see, is that security shouldn't be isolated anymore. It should be a thing that everybody cares about, like from QA. Like in an ideal world, it's not going to happen now, but in this day and age and for every company, but it shouldn't just be up to the security people to tell you how to, secure a product. Everybody should be thinking about it. And it's starting to be that way, especially for ops folks. One of the trends I'm seeing right now is when I go to conferences, I'm seeing a whole lot of, ops people be like, all of a sudden they're like, yeah, I care about ops, but I also care about security. Like, how do we secure things? And, there's kind of dual stuff. So I don't think it should be a separate process. I think it should be a part of the process. Now, I think that if there are security people present in your organization, that they should be, there to kind of guide you on what things to keep in mind, because that's definitely what they're there for. But at the same time, it shouldn't be solely up to security in order to, make the environment secure. Security is a team effort.
Yep, absolutely. And just if, as I said, I wanted to jump on that, one of the things we heard early on with DevOps was this sort of territorial fear by QA people that somehow DevOps was going to eliminate their job or we're going to change testing as we know it. And the fact of the matter is what we do with DevOps in terms of testing, and that's both security and traditional QA testing, is we automate a lot of these tests, right? We try to shift this test left. We shift testing left so that we test earlier in the dev process, earlier in deployment, pre-deployment. But that doesn't mean the QA function goes away. It means right? We automate a lot more tests,
Yeah.
but QA still has their job to do, which may not be just sort of simple tests that can be automated, but more important, more high value
Yeah.
type of
And
stuff.
yeah, and with DevOps, again, it's not saying that everybody do all the things. It's like everybody work together to make something happen.
Right.
And like even here, it's like even though on my team I do testing, I talk to my like director of QA all the time. Like I talk to the QA team all the time because we work together to create a product, and there may be some things in Opsland that they don't know about, and they're like, hey, can you look at this? Or there may be some things in QA land in testing that I may not know about, even though you know I'm doing testing on our infrastructure code. So it's good to have kind of that background. But specifically on security, it just shouldn't be up to the security people to to do all the things in terms of security, because there may be something that the security team needs to do in QA, but they don't know how to implement it in the QA world. They may not have that QA mindset, or there may be something that security needs to implement for compliance control in the infrastructure land, and they may not know how to do that. One thing to keep in mind is that some security people are just in compliance. They may not have a technical background. So, again, they need your help.
Yeah. And that's DevOps. We all need each other's help.
Exactly.
Okay, next question. Stephen Long says, most security mantras stress the importance of keeping systems patched. Often this causes existing code to break. Do you have any processes that you use other than regression testing, manual or automated, to ensure patching does not break production systems? Great question, Stephen.
That is a great question.
Any thoughts?
Ooh, man. To make sure systems are patched. Well,
and in doing so, we don't break the production systems.
And in doing so, we don't break the production systems. Well, have you also considered that, because there's also the thing that you have to consider when you're considering patching systems, whether they need to be patched or if you already have a mitigation in place that can, like if it breaks the system, okay, is this patch really, like you also have to consider before you're like, okay, let's patch away, is this patch really necessary, and do we already have mitigative measures in place so that this patch isn't required? Because sometimes sometimes for patching you may have a security vulnerability, but it may not necessarily apply to you. So like it may be like, oh, there's a security vulnerability, but only if this specific port is open. And you may not have it open. You may have it locked down in some way. So that's one thing to consider in addition to, I guess, the regression testing is, like, assess risk first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I'll tell you something else, specifically with patching, Jamisha.
Yeah.
I think there's a balance to be had between, when Microsoft used to do Patch Tuesday, every Patch Tuesday.
Yep. No, I remember Patch Tuesday.
Yeah. And people raced to make sure they were patched by 7 p.m. on Tuesday, or Patch Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that may work when you're a small startup, and even then you run into the kind of scenario that this gentleman talked about, which is it breaks some existing code or some internally developed app that Microsoft hadn't accounted for. But again, this is something that can be automated using staging or testing.
Yeah. In addition to that,
with the cloud, we can do that, right?
Yeah, like you can do automated testing, and and deployments to testing environments in order to, test to see if the code breaks or work on some solutions.
Yep. And what we see is there is a there's a balance to be made. Look, some patches are real hot, right?
Some patches are real hot and some patches are real hot and unavoidable, and it's like, no, you need to get this out. But
yep.
again, you just, what I'm trying to keep from doing is like going, okay, we're just going to patch all day, because again, that's
the hamster in the wheel.
Yeah. That's right? It's the hamster in the wheel, and it's kind of like that's very, very, that's overly paranoid security.
Yeah, I agree.
So making sure that you also assess risk, so that you're not kind of wasting resources in order to patch something that really doesn't necessarily need to be patched, or needs to be patched right away. But yeah, some things are hot, and you do have to, in addition to regression testing, you have to do maybe test deployment on testing environments and seeing what happens, or seeing how you can overcome it. And in addition to that, you may have to also work with your development team and be like, hey, this code is broken, how can we fix it? We do run into that a lot here, where it's like, hey, we need to upgrade this, and oh, by the way, you need to change this in your code. So it's also, in addition to just testing, also work with your development team.
Fair enough.
Unless you're talking about infrastructure, unless you're talking about code on like the software side. But if we're talking about what I think we're talking about, which is application code, work with your development team.
Fair. Okay. Next. Where can I find links to the tools that you mentioned?
I am actually going to see if I can put a post up.
You know what? Yeah, if you can get that together, and we'll post it up on DevOps.com for you. Happy
Sweet.
to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Next. And then our next one. Any example workflows that you can tell us about, Jamisha?
I think honestly, all of the past questions kind of answered some of the example workflows.
We got into them.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Fair enough. And then finally, Jamisha, if anyone has any questions or maybe wants to reach out to you afterwards, we're not asking you to give out personal details, but where can they get you with more questions?
So there's a few ways. There's info@cloudpassage.com. You can field questions there, and I can answer them. If you are on the Twitter, I am jamfish728. So feel free to mention me there. If you're local in the Bay Area, I have these tech meetups that I run in the morning in both San Francisco and Oakland. They're called Coffee Ops. This coming Coffee Ops is actually this Thursday, 8 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. at Red Brick Cafe. If you want to watch my Twitter, you can find details on that. I also run one in Oakland, closer to the end of the month at Awaken Cafe, from the same time, 8 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. But those are the best ways that you can reach me.
Excellent. Well, I don't see any other questions. Going once, twice, three times. For those of you who stayed on, thank you very much. And for those of you listening to this on recording, thank you very much for joining us. Jamisha Fisher, System Administrator at Cloud Passage, thank you so much for joining us today. And
thank you so much, Alan. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And thank you to Cloud Passage for sponsoring today's webinar. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com, and thank everyone, thank everybody for participating in today's webinar, and stay tuned for our next ones. You can visit DevOps.com/webinars or some events/webinars, or just go to the front page and hit the event button. to find out when our next webinars are and what they'll be on, as well as who our guests are. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending.